We're now on Daf Lamed Beis Omid Beis, and we have here in the list of trefos, we've got Nekuvas Haveshet Upsukas Hagageres. Now, what's going on over here? How could these be listed under the trefos when these are psule shchita? And Rabbi Akiva accepted finally the klal of Rabbi Yeshevev that if the psul is in the shchita, then it's a nevela, not a trefa. And these cases, for example, psukas hagagreris, which we see in our Mishnah, is considered a trefa. Why is it considered a trefa? I mean, this is a psul in the shchita. Omar Rav Lokash. Kan sheshachar ul b'sof posak, kan sheposak ul b'sof shachat. So again, first and foremost, let's understand the scenarios. The Gemara itself is going to try to explain why one case fits into the description of a psul shchita and the other does not. It's a davar acher garma. But let's get to mitzias, just the reality. Kan, which is referring to our Mishnah, and our Mishnah is going to establish that there's a psul shchita, and a result of the psul shchita, the animal is nevela, where he started a proper shchita. Once he starts a proper shchita, then there's no psul, or there's no shame trefa. All that's at stake now is, did he finish the shchita and do it properly? But no, lebasof pasak. Meaning, when he got to the veshet, after a fine shchita of the kana, I'm sorry, did I get that? Let me just go over that last point first. Again, he started with what? Let's say he started with the shchita of, right, he started with the shchita of the veshet, and he did that properly. And then when he came to the kana, he ripped it out. He didn't do a shchita. So that's called, in Rava's conceptual framework, that's a psul shchita. But kan, when do we classify this as a trefa? Then when we start the other way around, pasak u'besof shachat. Right? Let's say when it came to the kana, he ripped out the kana, and then he shechted the veshet properly. But that's not a psul shchita. Why? Because even before the shchita, it became a trefa. Let's see if I'm right. Shachat ulabasof pasak, he started with a very valid, perfect shchita. When he shechted the veshet, ulabasof pasak, and then when he got to the kana, he didn't do a proper shchita, but rather pasak. Right? Pasak means he ripped it out. It's an avela. And Rabbi Akiva conceded to Rabbi Yeshevev that since this psul is a psul in the shchita itself, because he began with a proper shchita, therefore it's nevela. But in the case of the Mishnah later on in Trefos, that pasak, it was already a trefa from the beginning. Ubesof shachad, even though he continued and he did a good shchita. There's no possibility of considering this a valid shchita, and then tell me that he messed up on the second simon. because already at the outset it was Pasak. And if it was Pasak, it became a treifa already then. So he never got a valid shechita off the ground. And in this case, apparently there's no machlokas whatsoever. The Mishnah is a stam Mishnah later on that it's a treifa. Now, I think I can understand this, but the Gemara doesn't like it. Eisvei Rav Acha, Rav Huna l'Rava, I don't get it. Let's take a look at our Mishnah. Our Mishnah has both cases where he started with a good shechita or where he ended with a good shechita. Why? It says, Shachar es haveshet u'posek es hagargeres. So he started with a good shechita, and there I will grant you, Rava, that your svar is correct, that since he messed up on the end of the shechita, knows after having shechted the veshet, he messed up on the kana, the gargeres. So he started with a good shechita. Therefore, the psul is now in the shechita. It's inherent in the shechita, and therefore it's nevela. But then the Mishnah continues and says, Posak es hagargeres, and then shachar es haveshet. He already at the outset has a situation where the gargeres, right, what we call the kana, was already ripped out. So therefore the animal should be a treifa, and yet it says nevela. According to you, Rava, how could you tell me that? Right? If he ripped out the kana before he started the shechita, that's not a psul shechita. That's already a davar acher garam lo. It's a treifa. And yet the Mishnah says, and apparently Rabbi Kiva conceded, it's an avela. So Rava now is going to have to reinterpret the Mishnah and like add a couple of words. Ema, should we say that, you know what the Mishnah means in that second case, where he started with Posak es hagrogeres? You should say, not the achakach shachar es haveshet, but rather ukfar shachar es haveshet meikara. But then you're repeating the same story over and over again. I'm going to reject this interpretation for two reasons. So you're just simply, regurgitating the same case as you had in the Reisha. V'od, and not only that, hotnan v'acharkach. How could you change the girsa as if it says ukvar shachar? It doesn't say ukvar shachar. In the text that we have, it says v'acharkach shachar. Eloma Rava. Now Rava has to go back to the drawing board and try again to explain how the Mishnah here that we're learning now in the second paragraph considers that even Rabbi Kiva concedes that it's an avela, whereas the Mishnah later on in the third parak in Treifos is going to consider it a treifa. Elama Rava, Yeshman avelos v'yeshman treifos. You know what? The Mishnah over there is not listing exclusively treifos, but it's listing cases where the shechita is not going to help you. It's not going to be valid. Whether it's an avela or a treifa, that the Mishnah is not entering into. So the Gemara now asks, wait a minute. If you're telling me the Mishnah is exhausting all the cases, whether it's treifa or nevela, why did the Mishnah leave out Chizkiah? V'lechshav nami Chizkiah de'amar Chizkiah saw gistra nevela. According to Chizkiah, if you cut the animal straight, vertically from top to bottom, or horizontally, and you cut off its head, then it's nevela. So if the Mishnah is listing all the cases in nevela, why didn't it include the case of Chizkiah? And furthermore, lechshov nabdi Rabbi Lazar, the Amar Rabbi Lazar, nitla yarech v'chalal shela nevela. Right? If let's say the thigh of the animal was removed, and you could see a cavity in the thigh of the animal, it's called nevela. Why isn't that listed as another case of nevela? So now the Gemara is going to differentiate between two different categories of nevela, one of which is covered by the Mishnah in Elu Treifus, and the other is omitted. Kika tani nevela de lo metame michayim, aval nevela de metame michayim lo kitani. There are two categories of nevela. There's an nevela which is metame michayim, meaning the animal is still fluttering, what we call pirkus, and yet it's metame. That's called tmea michayim. Again, it's not really michayim because al pidin is already dead, but it looks like it's alive, and it's already considered an nevela and it's metame. Those extreme cases, which are the cases of Chizkiah and Rebbe Lazar, are not going to be covered by that Mishnah. The animal is showing signs of life. It's jerking its limbs, so it looks like it's still alive, and yet it does not. And yet it's what? Oh, they say it's nevela, therefore it's metame tumas nevela, even though it looks like it's alive. Our Tana, meaning the Tana of the Mishnah in Elu Trefus, is only considering liachar misa, that the tumah is going to be delayed until after the animal is a lifeless carcass. Okay. Now, in order to reconcile our Mishnah, which establishes nevela, with the Mishnah later on that establishes treifa, we're going to introduce Reish Lakish, a whole new effort to reconcile the two Mishnayos. Reb Shimon ben Lakish Omar. Okay. Now, in order to introduce Reb Shimon ben Lakish, we have to say the following. Again, Reish Lakish wants to avoid this whole distinction between animals that are also midin nevela, animals also midin treifa. All the animals are treifos. All the animals are treifos. So why then does our Mishnah set up something which is called an nevela? If you're telling me that all the animals that are mentioned there in the Mishnah are treifos, including pasak, asagogeres, etc., is the answer is kan sheshochet makom chatach, kan sheshochet shalom makom chatach. There is a situation where Reish Lakish argues that even though this pasak es hagogeres, he could still implement a shchita, in which case the animal is going to be an nevela. How so? Because shokat b'makom chatach. In other words, where there was pasak hagogeres, where that hole is, he put his knife in and he continued inside, by putting his knife inside the hole and continued to sever the second simon. On the other hand, in the Mishnah later on in Treifos, shachat shelo b'makom chatach. And therefore, you cannot in any way, shape, or form integrate his shchita, shelo b'makom chatach, with the makom chatach, right, where there was a prior cut in the animal. And now Reish Lakish explains, shachat b'makom chatach nifsala b'shchitahi. When he continues from the makom chatach and completes the severing of the second simon, then in such a case, the psul here is nevela, because somehow we're able to integrate that makom chatach together with his shchita and call it a psul shchita. But shelo b'makom chatach, where there's no relationship between his shchita of the second simon and the original makom chatach, which makes the animal to treifa, so then the psul here is not a psul in the shchita, because the shchita has no relationship to the makom chatach, which makes the animal into a treifa. Ki davar acher gom leili pasal dam, and that fills the requirement of Rav Yesheva's categorization in his klal that if the shchita excuse me, if there's no psul in the shechita, then the animal is a treifa. And that's called davar acher garmul apostle, and that's the subject of the Mishnah there in Elu Treifos. Frekti Gemaru mi Omer Reb Shimon Lakish, is that really his opinion? V'Omer Reb Shimon Lakish shachet esakana v'achkach nikva hareya kshera alma keman demancha b'dikula damya hachinami kemancha b'dikula damya. Okay. Okay, what's flying over here? There's a connection between the kana, which is the windpipe, and the rea, which is the lungs. Right? The lungs are part of the breathing process. And Reish Lakish is going to tell us that there's a treifa called Nikivas Hareya. If the lung was punctured. The little I know about shechita, I don't know too much, is that after shechita they do what's called bitzputz. What do? They immediately take the lungs out of the animal and they put it into a pail of water to see whether or not bubbles come up. If bubbles come up, it's because the rea was punctured, and that means that the animal is a treifa. According to some, you don't need that because you assume that every animal is healthy until you know otherwise. And there's no reason to be choshesh that maybe it was punctured. So I don't know if you gentlemen eat glot meat, but if you do eat glot meat, then probably it means that they did this test called bitzputz to make absolutely sure that there's no nekiva, there's no hole in the rea. Now, Reish Lakish says the following. Let's say he shechted the kana, and immediately afterwards, the lung was punctured. But according to Reish Lakish, since we see and we understand that the lungs are connected to the kana, then there's no longer a treifa that's generated by the nekivas hareya because it's considered keman demancha b'dikuladam. It's as if the lungs are like somehow outside the body of the behemoth, and they're sitting there somewhere in a basket. B'dikula means in a basket. Since the kana is related to the rea, and they're considered as one entity, once he shechts the kana, then that's it. It's as if he's removed the lungs. And therefore, even if you find some sort of defect in the lungs, that's not a treifa, because it's keman de muncha b'dikuladam. Hachanami, let's see how the Makshon here is going to extend the logic of Reish Lakish to this case here. What happened? We said that if he shechted according to Reish Lakish shelo b'makom achatach, then it's not a treifa. I'm sorry. If he shechted, let me get it again. Shelo b'makom achatach, then it's a treifa. Just 1 second. Hachanami, kiman. The Gemara thinks that according to Reish Lakish, it should be a nevela. Why should it be a nevela? We just said that according to Reish Lakish, shalom b'makom achatach, it's a treifa, and that's the Mishnah later on. Frek the Gemara, nay, according to Reish Lakish's logic elsewhere, it's going to be a nevela. Why is it going to be a nevela? Because it's keman demunach b'dikula. So let me just get the logic. Because he's got the mokum achatach, and now he shechts the siman, right? Let me say what it's outside. So if I understand the Gemara correctly, what we're saying is that if we could apply the ruling of Reish Lakish of Keman de Muncha B'dikula Dami, then Fakir, it's not a treifa. Why is it not a treifa? Because one second. Why is it not a treifa? Because you have the mokum chatach. Now he shechs shelo b'mokum chatach. Why is that considered? Why should that be considered a nevela? Because to place the point. So again, it works like this. That part of the animal, like in the case of the lungs, is sort of like taken out of the behemoth, out of the body of the animal. And if that be the case, then basically he shechted only one siman. Because it was shalo b'mokum achatach, so that his shchita on shalo b'mokum achatach has no relationship to the mokum achatach. So therefore, you can't see it as anything but an avela, because the shchita of one siman is not a proper shchita. So I think at this point, the Gemara just drops it. Forget about Reish Lakish. We can't reconcile Reish Lakish. Ella, but now we're going to introduce Reb Chia with another possible record in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, another possible way of reconciling the two. Lo kasha kan kodem chazara, kan liacher chazara. Well, Mishnah lo zazav imkoma. In other words, Rabbi Akiva initially said treifa against Rabbi Shovev. Chronologically, at some later moment in time, he accepted and conceded to Rabbi Shovev. So the Mishnah over there, which lists like Posek Hagogeres, etc., as treifa, that's Rabbi Akiva in his initial opinion against Rabbi Yishovev. Our Mishnah, on the other hand, is li'achar chazara, after Rabbi Akiva rescinded and accepted the shita of Rav Yeshovev, and therefore it's nevela. Okay, now we'll see if we can make any sense out of Reish Lakish. Gufa, we had Reish Lakish before. Reb Shimon ben Lakish. Shachet asakana v'akach nikva hareya kshera. Right, because we said it's kiman demunach b'dikula damya. Amar Rava lo Amar Reb Shimon ben Lakish el bereya. Why did Reish Lakish make this statement with regard to the rea, the lungs, that even though the lungs were punctured, it still is a kosher shchita because we see the lungs as outside. That's only whole v'chai rea tluya b'kana, because the air that he breathes through the windpipe, that's what keeps the lungs going. If let's say he finds a puncture in the intestines, then the shchita is a shchita psula, even according to Reish Lakish. Maskif lo Rabbi Zera me'achar shenoldu ba simone treifa hitarta. What are you saying to me? There are two simonim. He has to shecht not only the kana but also the veshet. In between the shchita of the kana and the veshet, the animal became a treifa. And yet, Reish Lakish argues that it's not a treifa. And the shchita is shchita kshera. In other words, we view the shchita as beginning with the first simon and ending with the second simon, and it's all one halachic process, and we don't care what happens in the middle. We're totally oblivious. Even though, in the case of Reish Lakish explicitly, there was a puncture that developed in the lungs. But now the Gemara says in the name of Zera, Mali Bereya, Mali Bnei Me'ayim. If you're telling me that we look at the shchita as one continuous shchita, and we don't care what happens between the first simon and the other simon, and the basic underlying premise of Reish Lakish is that it doesn't become a treifa midway through the shchita, meaning between the first simon and the second simon. Who cares whether or not it's chay tluyim or not tluyim? Any of the intestines, the same thing should happen. But after Reb Zera's argument, he rescinded his view, and he accepts the logic, as we said before, of who is it, Rava? Did I get that right? The name of Rava, that it's a separate din in the Rea. And how do I know that Reb Zera finally accepted Rava? The boy Reb Zera nikfu b'nei me'ayim bein simon simon ma'u mimitzarfi simon rishon simon sheni, and therefore it's at least a valid shchita l'tar v'dei nevela olo from lina lav hainu de boy ilfa. Isn't this equal to the suffix of ilfa in hotzi ubers yodo bein simon simon ma'u? Right, if one limb of the animal, let's say its foreleg, was extended outside the body, so therefore the shechita now is no longer related to that foreleg, to that yad. Mao, what's the din? That was the suffix of ilfa. Mimitzarf siman rishon siman sheni l'tar v'dei nevelo lo. So we see clearly that Reb Zera is not coming up with a new America over here. He's not discovering a new suffix. It's the old suffix of ilfa, about hotzi ubers yoder bein siman l'simon. So the Gemara answers, and with this we'll complete it. Ad kan lo iboilon. When did Reb Zera vacillate? El litar midei nevela aval bachila asura. Certainly, Reb Zera would agree that if there's a puncture in the intestines between the first shchita, the first semen, and the shchita, the second semen, it's certainly b'achila asura. He says here, and we'll wrap it up here. Had Reb Zera still held that the treifa status is incurred only when a fully vital animal incurs one of the 18 fatal, the intervening puncture of the intestine would have ended the animal treifa. Right? He already cut the kana. The animal was not fully vital at the time that it was punctured. The fact that Reb Zera acknowledges that the animal is prohibited for consumption indicates that he views the intestines as still attached to the animal, right? It's not kimunach dami. Okay, this is where we'll stop for today. And the Mitzvah tomorrow, same time, same station, we go on to Daf Lamed Gimel Emir Hashem. Thank you so much. Have a great day.